Okay, so you can see there's various values. You can look over this on your own. I don't need to go explain it in detail. But the point is that you have particular formats for each of these different properties of the date object. So the other thing, of course, is methods. And the one thing that's a little different with this, that sometimes you think if you execute a method to change a value of a property, that it automatically changes that variable of that type date that you created. But that's not the case. You may just want to get the value out and then add to it and use it in a local variable. So if you really want to change the actual underlying date variable, then you have to set an assignment statement assignment. And you'll see an example of that in the book, as well as I think right here on this next slide. So I'm just saying that here you have the same variable, but by running this method that is to add the amount of 3 hours, it gets updated because of this assignment statement. So now we're looking at the use of new, and that it's a new keyword with the date constructor. And so we can see here that you basically have the dim statement. You're declaring the variable delivery, which is of type date, and then at the same time you're executing the new constructor, which is literally some code. It's just a procedure somewhere, and by typing this new, it gets executed, that code does, and it'll load right here with these input values. Basically, there's also such a thing as a shared member, which is, as you can read here, a method or property that's accessible through that type's name. So this is something we'll use with things like date, because like you want it to pick up the system date. So the system date is a shared member. By just typing the dot operator in now, it's going to load the current time into the local date variable in this application when it executes. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The local variable name is current time. It's of variable type object date. And here today is similar. This one we're saying current day. It's again of date variable type object date. And I've got some additional information here, so that the main thing here with today is that it returns the current date with the time set to 0. So the focus is not the time, you're just focusing on the day with this if you use today, whereas now it gets the precise second. MSDN, if you're looking at their documentation, you'll see a little S symbol to indicate that shared members. Just a little aside. Now here's where I'm giving you another example of the overload constructor we talked about. And I already told you that it allows you to call different functions, and the computer knows which one to execute based on the variations in the signatures. That's just a fancy way of saying different number of parameter arguments, or different types, variable types, or even just that they're in a different order. Altogether, those arguments are referred to kind of as a signature. So date actually has 11 overload constructors, so you can see there's lots of variations with date. This example is a little more sophisticated. By the way, remember the single quote here is designating a comment. This is just showing you if you wanted to create a new instance. By the way, I'll just remind you of that use of that term. An instance is when you actually generate an instantiation of a particular variable with these values. So it's of course the date time object type variable instance. Anyway, the values are to be this particular day, that particular time, and this format, English US, for a calendar. That's PM kind of should have maybe been over here to make it a little more make sense. So here's the code. First, you're declaring info variable as a new system.globalization.culture info variable. So here again you see the new, so you're getting a constructor to execute. This whole thing here, system globalization culture info, is the variable type. This info is the local instantiation of the variable of that type. And then here we have the input parameters for the constructor to set it up. These are kind of built in, where they're relating to each other. So now we're declaring a variable type with the name calendar, the type system globalization.calendar, but we're setting it equal to calendar equal to info.calendar. So we're saying we want the calendar to be in the format for this particular date. Then finally we say my date time, that's our local variable name. Here we're executing a constructor, again new. It's of type system.datetime, and then here are the input arguments, including this calendar that you declared up here is one of the input arguments. So remember I told you earlier that our book only talks about 6 arguments, but you can see here there's more than 6. So I told you that our book was not exactly accurate. It was just trying to simplify, because with date it can get kind of complicated. You don't have to do things like this for this class. I'm just trying to help you understand how these objects kind of build and interact, and how giving you more examples of how new constructor works. Finally, once you've done all that, the idea here is to display again to console system.console.writeLine the current date. This is just a comment again right here. Okay, moving on to something else that's new here, the DateTimePicker control. Remember that that is a user interface object, and you just drag it out there to the screen. It allows you to customize it. You can use the calendar, but if you don't want it to use the calendar for the user selecting the input, you can use that show up down property and set it to true. That's what was done in the application for this chapter. So the benefit of this input control, one of them is this: it automatically does input validation. You can trust that it's in the right format, because that's the only thing it will turn over to your code. GroupBox, we mentioned that as another new thing. It's basically a container. So you perhaps, like if you have checkboxes you want to group together, or a certain segments of user input, you can put them all in a GroupBox container, and that way you can kind of place them relative to the container itself. So you can move the container around, and all the objects will retain their relative distances and spacing. Okay, the timer control is an object that runs code, and it's kind of unusual in that it's not something you see. When you put it on the stage, you will not see it. It's actually, if you want to find it again, it's down there below the stage area that the user sees in the component tray area. And basically it generates a tick, and every time it generates a tick, that can be an event, and so you can associate an event handler piece of code to respond to a tick. So you specify how long or how frequent you want that tick to occur. It's kind of referred to as the wait period. And so that's basically, the chapter says we're going to set the interval to 1,000 because it's based in milliseconds, and so that way every second it's going to cause the event handler to execute. Okay, finally we have a new event handler, and it's called form_load event handler, and you basically add this to your class because you want something to execute prior to the form displaying to the user. So let's say you wanted to initialize some things, and was based on certain values in a database. So we haven't gotten to that yet in this class, and we probably won't get to it where you read and write from a database, but I do plan on reading and writing from a text file. So perhaps there's something in the text file that would alter how the form is set up. Well, you would need to then read the text file in a event handler, a special one called form load, and detect whatever the parameters are so that you would know how then to set up the form because of that particular input. So it's placed typically at the top of the code so that we know it executes first, and so you want to start placing things as we get more event handlers and more things happening. You want to place them in order of execution if there is some that make more sense to be first. Now here's another type of event handler, and this is the one associated with the timer control object, value changed event handler. So basically you can detect something. In this case, a value is changing within that timer. It's the millisecond thing is changing, increasing, and so that would then trigger the event to go ahead and execute. So it's not limited to any particular type of event. It's intended to be pretty general. You may set some sort of value so it only executes when a specific value is reached. So then again, you know, it's just something so you understand the versatility that event handlers are not just responding to a user click. It can be something that's set up in an automated way like the timer control. Alright, so here I'm just pointing out that in the dim statement you can call a function, which is the case here, and so then that is initializing the date state. That's something I've been discouraging, but I just wanted to let you know that you can do that with this particular IDE. Some IDEs, as I've said in class, won't let you, but the book does it, so I wanted to point out if you were going to do that with date, this is the syntax. And then finally, this is something else that is a little bit new, so I decided to highlight that, and that is that we have the format. This is another way. Delivery is the date, and you can format it for output. Too long date string or too short time string. So these are other methods that are used to designate formatting, and that's a fairly common, easy way to do it, and it's pretty self-explanatory, the kind of formatting. Again, delivery is a date time object, and this is a method associated with that object, and then it just resolves and puts itself right here before it performs the final string concatenation. So that's what I wanted to talk about for chapter 14. Do look over the book and the shipping exercise or application, excuse me, on your own, and I will see you, if not sooner, definitely after spring break. Thank you.